When people got to the end of the 2-hour program, they were asked, what do you think this means for you? And what should you be thinking about? The results were stunning. People made comments like, we've never had it understood. We've never had it explained that way before. We've never understood the big picture. We've never had a pathway that seems clear and the opportunity to do something.
Welcome back to Engines of Creation. I'm your host, Christian Mastrodonato. You just heard a clip from my conversation with Roger Dennis. Roger is an expert in foresight who has spent 25 years advising senior leadership teams across the globe. In today's episode, we explore what it means to get above strategy. Roger argues that in our highly volatile operating environment, relying on traditional 3 to 5 year strategy cycles is unhinged. Furthermore, managing complexity requires organization to stop discounting the future by delaying difficult conversations until it's too late. We examine the mechanics of systemic change using Stewart Brand's Space Layers framework, specifically looking at how the exponential advancement of AI as an infrastructure layer is ricocheting all the way down to impact our natural systems. Roger also shares a phenomenal real-world case study on anti-fragility. He breaks down how an immersive foresight exercise prepared a New Zealand healthcare organization to not just survive, but actively adapt and outperform others in the immediate aftermath of a devastating earthquake. This conversation is a masterclass in navigating ambiguity, mitigating asymmetric risk, and managing complex systems. Before we begin, if exploring these systemic frameworks brings value to your work, please take a moment to follow Engines of Creation on your platform of choice and share this episode with a friend or colleague. Decoding complexity is a collective effort, and your support helps this community to grow. Now, let's go! Welcome, everyone, to Engines of Creation podcast. And of course, most of all, welcome, Roger. It's great to have you here today, and it's great to have a great expert in forecasting, and especially considering all the things going on in this complex world nowadays. It's great to have someone like Roger that can give us some ideas on how we can navigate in all this complexity. So welcome to the podcast, Roger, and tell us a bit more about yourself.
Great. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So my name is Roger Dennis. I've worked around the world advising senior leadership teams for 25 years and really helping them understand where the world could possibly go, how to start difficult and challenging conversations about possible futures. I don't try and predict the future. That's crazy, but really what you're trying to do is start these difficult conversations about where things might go and present options to mitigate risk and realize opportunity. That's it in a nutshell.
That really sounds a perfect topic for this podcast. And let's start talking about how we can look into these futures. And one thing that I heard you talking is heavily discounted futures, and also related to the point that I think nowadays is important to getting above strategy. What do you mean with those terms?
So heavily discounted futures is really this idea that for some leadership teams, it's very challenging for them to think about where the world might possibly go. Therefore, it's easier to simply try and push that aside. The pace of turnover in some leadership teams is such that people can do 18, 24 months in a role and then move on to another role and effectively keep discounting what might possibly eventuate because it's too difficult. It's hard to have the conversation. It's hard to get your head around where things might go. And so effectively what you're doing is discounting the future by delaying the conversation and never having it in the first place. The other thing I talk about, and you mentioned there, is this concept I use about getting above strategy. And that really relates to this idea that, in my experience, every organization has its own different flavor of how they think about strategy, how they think about options, how they make choices, which frameworks they use. But these large macro scale drivers of change affect everything. And so, therefore, what I try and do is help organizations think about some of these macro scale changes, start filtering it into what it could possibly mean for a sector or for an organization, and then get to the right questions. Often, what happens is I find that people just want to rush to the answer. What are we going to do in this quarter? What's in the next 3 quarters? What's our response? They don't spend enough time thinking about the right question. And you're far better to have an approximate answer to the right question than the exact answer to the wrong question. So that's what I mean about getting above strategy. Foresight, scenario techniques, and other tools like that should really inform a strategic response and help organizations stop discounting the future.
I can see the relationship of a previous conversation we had some time ago about product strategy, in that case with Roman Pichler. And at the time, he was really making the point of distinction between product strategy and business commercial strategy. And what I'm hearing here is that probably there is even another layer, which is this sort of forecasting long-term strategy. Now, a couple of questions about that. Is it fair to say that when we look so far ahead, you shouldn't have only one strategy? Or better, if you move above strategy, you start talking about different scenarios unfolding and being ready for different answers happening at the same time. So I think if you go back to asking the right question, you might end up to be thinking about multiple answers. Is it fair?
So you should really have the ability to think about how different scenarios might play out. My preference is really to have 2, maybe 3 scenarios, and then think about what questions do those scenarios put out. They could be questions around mitigating risk or around realizing opportunity. And then you start to filter down into what are the strategic options that start to present themselves. And there may be a range of different ways you think about this, but effectively the level of volatility now in the global operating environment means that this idea that some organizations have that we can do 3-year strategy cycles or 5-year strategy cycles seems almost unhinged. Because imagine if you did a 5-year strategy in 2019 or a 3-year strategy in December last year. And so actually having cycles set up where you'll have those difficult and challenging conversations in advance, where you have agility of response, and where you have those conversations before you need to have them, I think is really important. If you're in reactive mode in a crisis, then you've been caught by a shock or caught by a surprise. The idea of foresight techniques and scenarios is to mitigate the risk of being surprised and being caught by shocks.
One thing that came up in other conversations is also the importance of an element of discipline and cadence. So I would assume that you do this exercise, this forecasting exercise, and after a while, it will become stale in some way because the world shifted in the meantime. So what, especially in nowadays with all this very much, how you could say, climatic and geopolitical uncertainties, how often should this exercise happen?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of how often it should happen. It's more a matter of building the capability in the organization that can respond to the level of volatility that's occurring at the time. So you really should think about, do you have the people with the right skills and the right background to be able to start the processes off? So capabilities first. Then you should think about processes. It's not just a one exercise. How do you build a process so that is repeatable, so it's understood, so it's not just a group of people in a room with beanbags and whiteboards chatting back on energy drinks? And then finally, what is the routine that the organization requires? So how often should you be doing this? So capabilities, processes, and routines. Now, routines may vary depending on the environment, on the reporting cadence in the organization, on the strategy cycle, but I would suggest that you want to be having this as an ongoing process. And some organizations explicitly recognize that. Shell is one of the better organizations in the world that carry out this process. They publish scenarios on a regular basis that informs their strategy options as well and starts those conversations at a leadership team level. And you need to be thinking around what is the right frequency for us to be refreshing, to be able to feed signals into a strategy team, to be able to have options and responses lined up rather than waiting for the shock. So that's a very long way of saying it depends. It depends on the organization, depends on the capabilities, depends on how often you need to be able to input into that strategy process, but not 3 years and not 5 years.
You talked about capabilities and processes, and you also alluded earlier about tools. And definitely it can relate where in some situations you can see some companies trying to do this forecasting exercise, but not necessarily in the right way. And you end up basically, I would say, decoupling it's the right level of imagination to think about the right questions, and you start just sort of going into speculation of potential futures which are not necessarily relevant for the job. And so it becomes sort of empty exercise, I would say, that don't really inform strategy. So what are the tools or methods that you usually suggest to make this work?
So before we get to that, I want to pick up on something you just mentioned there, which is organizations, if they have a legal problem, they would bring in legal experts. If you have an accounting issue, you would bring in an auditing firm, one of the big four firms. You bring in experts. What tends to happen in many organizations is the strategy team might be made up of corporate misfits, people who have wide ranging interests, who have shown themselves to be adaptable but don't really want to fit in an operational area, might get pushed into strategy. Now they say, well, actually, we want you to think about scenarios. I've actually had this conversation with one organization recently where they said, we've got someone who's sort of interested in that, and they've read quite a bit, and that plus a little bit of chat GPT, and we can do our own scenarios. And I felt like saying to them, does that work with your legal department? Does that work with your health and safety team? Does that work with your finance director? You've got someone who knows how to use a spreadsheet, who's read a couple of books, and they'll be the ones that do the accounts for the year. No. And so you need to pull in expertise, people who have deep subject matter knowledge of this area. And the challenge is that in many organizations, those people just don't exist. So I had a conversation just about an hour ago with one organization, a global company, 14,000 people, and they have been specifically looking for people that already have in the organization that can help them build a foresight capability and also look at geopolitical risk. They didn't find anybody. 14,000 people. And so now they're doing the right thing and starting talking to experts, thinking about bringing on capabilities as opposed to saying to somebody, well, you don't really fit in operations, you don't fit in finance, you don't fit in sales. Have a go at this chat GPT, read a couple of books and you'll be fine. So that's the first thing, like getting the right people. Once you have the right people, then you can start to figure out what tools work really well. So a good Foresight practitioner will have a range of different tools and techniques that you can use. However, the key thing in my mind is how do you capture the scarce attention in limited time of busy executives? So it's not just enough to think about scenarios and backcasting and wargaming, etc. You need to think about how do you actually get somebody's attention in a way that cuts through. Otherwise, you can be doing the best stuff in the world, and if it doesn't have a receptive audience, it doesn't land, it doesn't resonate, there's no point in doing the work.
Something that comes up often, of course, is the focus on people. So thanks for expanding the answer, making the important point that, first of all, you need to have the right people. And it's not just a couple of books and the ChatGPT, but it's about really understanding and creating the right capabilities. So related to that, do many companies take the opportunity when they bring expert in also to upskill the internal people to make these capabilities more stable within the organization, or it stays more as a one-off, we invite the expert when we need this support every some time?
That's a great question, and I'm going to answer it in a longish way by going back in history a little bit. So if you think about frameworks by which strategy professionals carry out their work, and you look at some of the dominant frameworks and ones that are still in use today, things like Porter's Five Forces, it's from 1979, or Blue Ocean Strategy from like 2004. If you go back further to the early to mid 70s, the prevailing way of thinking about operating in a volatile world was scenario planning. Shell had proven that it worked really well, and they built capability in that space, and they still have the best scenarios team in the world. And what I think you're seeing now is more explicit recognition of the need to build in-house capability so that you're not just bringing in somebody to do something once and not just having a one-off type engagement. It's really interesting in some of the sessions that I run where I'll be talking to a board or an exco and I'll bump into one of the members, a month, 6 weeks later, and I'll say to them, how'd the session go? And what'd you think? And they go, I took lots of notes. And I'll go, that's great. And they go, oh no, it was really good. It was great. I did take lots of notes, but nothing else. And so in my mind, that means that it's almost not a return on value because you've had this great group of minds assembled in the room. You've got their attention, but they've just taken notes and then moved on to the next thing. So I think you need to build capability inside the organization. You need to have those processes and routines set up. You need to think about how to capture the scarce attention of busy board members or executive operators so that it's not just we took great notes or we do that once a year, but there's a capability being built inside so that there is explicit recognition of this. The challenge is for many organizations to get up to speed, you need to bring in external experts right now.
Yes, I get it. And I think that's the opportunity to bring the external expertise to upskill and create that knowledge. Shifting a bit gears, it happens, I think not by chance, that you also touched in your writings on a topic, particularly a book that I love from Stewart brand, How Building Learns. And it's, in particular, you refer to the shear layers. And I can see you actually built a game which is called Layer Player. And in my, I would call amateur interest in forecasting, I'm definitely one of the guys who read a couple of books, maybe more than a couple, but definitely by far not an expert. It's a book I love, and I always recommend to everyone who is interested about innovation, because in the past, I did work in a built environment applying Internet of Things and AI. It's a very interesting space for innovation. And you can see the different phases of hundreds of years old buildings where you're also trying to layer up things over and over. So it's a beautiful place actually where you can learn and you can see this long-term game playing up, looking from the past to the future. I can definitely recognize that as a tool. And it's also a topic that came up multiple times in the podcast by other experts, not necessarily in Foresight, maybe more on innovation, but it is definitely, I would say, a foundational concept, the shear layers. And so I would like, with your help, to give an idea of the power of this tool, asking you how we can apply it with a very specific situation we are right now, which is the impact of AI. Giving a bit of context for the listeners, the point from Stewart Brands is that you can look at systems. It can be applied to literally any system between fast layers and slow layers. The fast layers are usually the commercial side, the fashions, the things that change very quickly, could be technologies themselves. And then there are the slow layers as well, like the governance, the nature itself, that change much more slowly. And his point is that innovation happens at the frictions between these layers, and they move at different paces. And every sometimes, a little bit like an earthquake, you have like these shears happening and this vibration, you might argue. And that's where innovation opportunities are. And I think it's a beautiful concept, it's a beautiful metaphor. And I appreciate probably the short version of your answer is going to be, it depends. If you try to make a mental exercise, we look at the rapid deployment of AI, and we hear a lot about work displacement and so forth. So where do you see this layer friction between this super fast layer coming in from AI technology and all the other low layers that you are seeing are playing out from the point of view of governance? And you can see different governments reacting in different ways versus, of course, companies are somehow stuck in the middle from the point of view of rethinking maybe the way they operate, but they also have to deal with this lower side. So how do you see the impacts coming of this friction that is literally happening in front of our eyes?
Yes, good question. And the pace layer framework from Stewart Brand is very powerful because, as you mentioned, it sort of presents the world sort of as sedimentary layers, more like an onion, but there's different levels of influence. So the further you go down the stack, the more influence those layers have. And the layers at the base have all the power and usually move slow, but the layers at the top, like commerce and infrastructure, typically move a bit faster and get all the attention. Now, also usually what happens in this model is that changes at the very top of the stack don't usually affect layers at the very bottom. Now, I say usually because if you look at the stack, there's fashion, commerce, infrastructure, governance, culture, and then natural systems. This sort of links back to the start of the conversation around discounting the future. So the current system of capitalism heavily discounts planetary impacts. So you don't generally find on a balance sheet, in some organizations you do, but other minority, like the planetary impact of business activity unless there's a material cost. But that way of doing business over the past few decades has meant that changes at the top of the stack are now going right down to the bottom and starting to impact the natural systems. And climate change is the biggest impact, but not the only one, because planetary boundaries are being exceeded all over the place. So now what you see is discounting the future, and a layer at the top of the stack ricochets right down to the bottom into natural systems and is now reverberating all the way back up the stack. Now that's an example of how that pace layers framework can be thought of. When it comes to AI, I view AI as an infrastructure layer, much like electricity or transportation, air travel, etc. Now, the fundamental difference with AI is that now we've created machines that can build faster machines without human intervention. So this is fundamentally different to any other previous technology revolution. And it will ricochet down the stack. It will go down into culture, into governance, and then that will ricochet back up into commerce. And I think given the exponential pace at which frontier models are developing, then there is no precedent for where this might go. However, having a framework that allows you to build to like a mental model around these impacts is really important. If you think about what's going on with construction costs and electricity and water usage, then you can see AI going right down through the stack all the way into natural system, and some of those resource shortages going right back up the stack now, particularly in terms of water and electricity demands for data centers.
It's so powerful exactly how this framework allows you to see across all the stack and really look at the systemic view of whatever is going on is touching all the different things. And I also love the example of climate change because it shows how, especially the infrastructure layers that we build, they actually affect the environments around us. And we tend to not to look at it. And well, without, it would be a completely different conversation. But of course, there's a lot to say about the fact that economic models historically, they look at these as externalities and they're not necessarily part of the model itself.
So just before we go on to the next thing, you mentioned a layer player, and it's probably worth having a little discussion about that. So it dovetails back into what I was talking about earlier about capturing scarce executive attention. So layer player is something I've created which brings an abstract model like pace layers to life in the form of sort of like a version of that popular wooden stacks building block where you try and move a block out from the bottom without toppling the entire stack. And so layer player is a way of bringing to life this idea that if you can move any blocks on the commerce layer, but the commerce layer won't really change. But if you start moving a block in the infrastructure layer below commerce, like AI, or you start moving something in the governance layer, like populism, or you start moving something in the cultural layer, like polarization or language, then all the layers on top start to look very fragile. Now, layer player is a model that sits about 20 centimeters high, and it's built in wooden blocks. Each layer is a different color. It has a description laser etched on it. And I knew it would capture executive attention when I had sort of like a working prototype, and a chief exec saw it on my desk and said, I want one of those on my desk. And the difference between that and a report or a slide deck or whatever is that those things are easily forgotten. You can file them away, you can stick them in your drawer, you can file them on your server, whatever. But in my area, this concept of experiential futures, so how do you create experiences or tangible objects that actually bring some of these ideas to life, is something that I try and do all the time. How do you cut through the pile of reports? How do you chop through the inbox? How do you avoid being filed? And layer player is a classic example of bringing a abstract framework to life in such a way that it really cuts through. When a chief exec says, I want one of those for my desk, you know you've got cut through.
Absolutely. And Yeah, you touched something very important, I believe, which is the physical side of way we interact with our mental models. And there are persons, might be definitely person, it might be one of those who can stay a little bit more in their own mind and they can build the models in their own mind. But a lot of people, they have to touch things. They have to touch things to actually understand the model that you're talking about. They have to see and they have to interact with the model. And I think that's very powerful. And not by chance, a lot of these people, they tend to be commercial decision makers because, well, that's what you need. You need that practical mindset of how can I make, revenues and break even the next month. That's really their job. And so that practicality implies that I can see the value for them of touching and not just thinking about these mental models. Otherwise, it's really hard to figure them out. This is a very practical example, I would say, of the success of the forecasting approach. But many times in my careers working in innovation, also trying to bring in forecasting conversation, of course, with experts like you and others, it's sometimes a hard sell. In very large companies, to make an example, Shell, it might be a little bit easier sometimes, but sometimes it's still a hard sell because you do not necessarily see the commercial value the next 3 months. And I would like to somehow flip the question in a way. And of course, you talked a lot about the value of doing it. And I would like to get your view on what's the cost of not doing it, especially nowadays, and from your perspective, because I believe that's really about it. Looking from a practical perspective, I think it's hard sometimes to see the value because it's very much long-term thing. But actually, I feel there is a practical cost in not doing this sort of exercises that rolls down into your strategy and inform even your next day's decision with this long-term view.
Yes, and I can give you a lot of examples, but we're short on time, so I'll give you one specific one. Gosh, about a decade ago, I was working with a healthcare organization in New Zealand, and we had the brief of helping the leadership team understand where problems started occurring in the system in the next 10 years. And by problems, effectively what it meant was governments are pretty much cash constrained. Money's not falling from the sky to build new hospitals. Hospitals are expensive. This particular part of New Zealand had a population that was aging faster than other parts of the country. An aging population means you have increased healthcare requirements because as you age, you need more care. And then also the problem with an aging population is you have a decreased workforce. So we built scenarios that outlined where this might go for the healthcare system. And the challenge we had was that there were 18,000 people working in this healthcare system. And so by engaging with the executive team and some other senior leaders, we probably had 30 or 40 people who roughly understood what the implications of these scenarios were. But the challenge from the chief exec was, how do we get thousands of other people to understand what's going on? Because as a chief executive, you only have limited ability to direct. And actually what you want is sort of like a widespread understanding across a complex system so people start moving of their own volition. So effectively what we did was create this experience where we took over a warehouse. It was about 10,000 square feet. And we set up a cross between a corporate roadshow, a mission document, and an interactive museum. I had a team of theatre set designers, electricians, videographers, photographers, and we built this experience where people came through in groups of 10. It took them about 2 hours to go through, but what we did was bring these scenarios to life. And we brought them to life by creating different experiences. We had a guide that would take these groups through. We talk about constraints, opportunities, people who'd made change happen. We didn't talk specifically about scenarios, But when people got to the end of the 2-hour program, they were asked, what do you think this means for you? And what should you be thinking about? And the results were stunning. People made comments like, we've never had it understood. We've never had it explained that way before. We've never understood the big picture. We've never had a pathway that seems clear and the opportunity to do something. And this experience we called Showcase became the foundation for a very large-scale, decade-long transformation program. Now, a year after we did Showcase, a very large earthquake hit the city, and within 60 seconds, there was reduced infrastructure because buildings were damaged, increased demand on the system from injuries and from trauma in the system, and the decreased workforce because people left the city because they'd lost their homes, lost their jobs, etc. And so in 60 seconds, the preconditions for the scenarios came to life in a way that we could not have anticipated. But this transformation program had already been underway for 18 months. And effectively, this healthcare organisation outperformed other healthcare organisations in New Zealand on key metrics just 3 months later. And the media interviewed the chief exec and said, how is it possible that you've just suffered this major disaster and you're still doing better than other healthcare organisations who haven't had a disaster? And the chief exec at the time said, we were already thinking about these sort of scenarios, and this is just an excuse to go faster. So we didn't anticipate this happening. We started difficult and challenging conversations at a leadership team level. We brought it to life with an experience that resonated. We asked people in a particular way what they thought they should be doing in light of these scenarios. And it started this transformation program across thousands of people in a way that simply wouldn't be possible any other way. We got them thinking about the right questions. We got them thinking about difficult conversations. We got them thinking about new ways to provide healthcare, new ways to operate. A whole range of changes came out of this transformation program, which meant that when disaster hit, and it was a total shock, the system was so much more resilient and adapted much quicker to the point it was functioning at a higher level than other organizations that were the same but didn't have the disaster.
It's an amazing example. And with the positive example, it also answers also the negative point of saying, well, it's very clear what would have happened if this transformation wasn't in place. And after such, it would have taken years for this healthcare organization to rebuild itself, but it was actually resilient and able to improve. That makes me think also another concept that comes up often in this topic, which is the concept of anti-fragility. So then this sounds to me the perfect example of how to build an anti-fragile organization and actually strive and improve out of a shock instead of just resisting or crumbling down.
Yes, and I have this saying I really like, which is you can't build the fire station once the fire has started. And so by coming back to these conversations that you would not otherwise normally have, by being a bit uncomfortable, by not discounting the future, those are important parts of a process which stops you being shocked. If you think about the processes behind key Foresight tools and techniques, really what you're trying to do is say, there aren't any shocks, there aren't any surprises, there might be things we haven't thought of in terms of how they might manifest themselves, but we have learned from previous examples. We have the ability to have these difficult conversations. We've thought about some of the responses. Mentally, we've got the capabilities, we've got the processes and the routines, and we know how that can lend strength to the organization.
That's great. Thank you. It's a very powerful example to close the episode and to show the value, the practical value of implementing these methods and building going back to the beginning, building these capabilities inside an organization, because not just about doing it, it's about really creating the craft inside an organization to be able to constantly look into that and evolve. And that's absolutely great.
I have two or three more examples, but we're out of time. Each of them is equally compelling. I think that's one of the key things around when you're looking for key experts to help you on this journey. What's the track record?
Yeah, that's what you want to see, going back from the practical standpoint of the executive that wants to look at the future. And that's great. So I think we got almost to the end. And so I'm going to ask you the question I ask all the guests, and I think it's going to be particularly interesting today. So, what are the characteristics of a leader who embraces complexity?
I anticipated that question. It's part of my foresight process. I think the characteristics are curiosity, tolerance. Tolerance for ambiguity, because some organizational leaders want black and white. This is never black and white. Understanding that you need to think about how you mitigate risk and realize opportunity. And you've had exposure to different geographies, different sectors, and different styles from different leadership teams. I'm always really interested to work with leaders who've had really diverse careers in different geographies, different sectors, etc., with different teams, because they seem to be the ones that have a much higher acceptance and valuing of some of the ambiguity, aren't so stuck in the black and the white, and understand that strategy needs new inputs in a volatile environment.
That's a great answer. And it touches across a lot of other topics that have been discussed in this podcast and all very valuable. So thanks a lot, Roger, for your time with us today. It was a lot of information. I would share the link to your website for anyone who's interested, actually to the other examples you alluded to. And of course, they want to dive down more into the world of forecasting.
Yes.
So thank you very much, Roger.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's been a great conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you.